The lawyer's voice cut through the room like a blade. No, she stays. My mother's face went white, my brother's jaw tightened. Nobody had expected this, least of all me. 20 minutes earlier, I'd been told I didn't belong in that office, that the reading of my grandmother's will was family business, and that I somehow wasn't family enough to hear it. I stood up to leave the way I always did. But before I reached the door, everything changed. 3 days before that, I was still in my dress uniform in the back of a rental car, watching the Ohio farmland roll past the window, wondering if I'd made it home in time for dinner. I hadn't seen my family in 8 months. 2 deployments back to back will do that. I told myself it didn't matter that I was used to missing things. Birthdays, holidays, the small ordinary Tuesdays that make up a life. What I wasn't used to was walking into my parents' dining room and feeling like a guest. Daniel was already there when I arrived, sitting at the head of the table like he'd been born into that seat. He was in the middle of a story about the new deck he was building, how Dad had helped him out with the contractor, how the loan for the addition had finally cleared. I sat down without changing out of my travel clothes. Nobody asked about the flight. Nobody asked where I'd been stationed. My mother refilled Daniel's glass before she even looked at me. When I mentioned I'd have to head back to base earlier than planned, a training rotation had moved up. My mother didn't even pause over her plate. "You're just in the military," she said like she was correcting a child. "Don't expect this family to revolve around your schedule." I didn't say anything. I'd learned a long time ago that answering back only made things worse. And besides, this wasn't new. It was just the newest version of something old. In my family, there were 2 kinds of children. Daniel was the one building a future, a house, a business, a life anyone could point to and understand. I was the one who'd left, not served, left. As if putting on a uniform and choosing discipline over comfort was some kind of abandonment. It hadn't always been that way. When I was young, my grandmother Margaret was the one person who saw me clearly. She was the one who sat with me at her kitchen table and told me I didn't need anyone's permission to become someone. She was the one who drove me to the recruiter's office the week I turned 18, when my mother wouldn't even get in the car. My mother never forgave either of us for that day. To her, my choosing the army wasn't independence, it was rejection. Meanwhile, Daniel stayed close to home, married young, and started a small contracting business that never quite stood on its own. My parents were there every time it wobbled, a down payment here, a loan there, a truck and insurance bill month after month, year after year. I never asked them for a dime. I told myself that was fine, that I didn't need it, that I'd built something they couldn't touch or take credit for. But every time I came home, my mother reminded me anyway. "Your brother has a family," she'd say, as if that settled some debt I didn't know I owed. "He needs us more." I used to think it was about money. It took me years to understand it wasn't. It was about who got to be chosen. In that house, love wasn't unconditional. It was allocated like a budget, and I had somehow always come in last on the list. I was still turning that thought over in my head, lying awake in my old childhood bedroom, that night when my phone rang just after 11. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. It was my aunt. Her voice was thin and careful in the way people get when they're about to say something they can't take back. "Catherine," she said. "It's your grandmother. She's gone." I don't remember hanging up. I remember sitting on the edge of that narrow bed, staring at the wall, feeling something drop out from under me that I hadn't even known was holding me up. Margaret Ellis had been 89 years old, and some part of me had quietly assumed she'd outlast all of us out of sheer will. She was the only person in that family who had never once made me feel like I needed to explain myself. I was on a flight back within 36 hours, still in the same clothes I'd packed for a 2-day visit. When the taxi pulled up outside her house, the yellow one with the wraparound porch, the one where I'd learned to ride a bike and shell peas and believe I was worth something, I sat in the driveway for a long time before I could make myself get out. I stood on the front walk with my hand on the gate, looking at the porch light. She always left on. And for the first time in years, I let myself cry without checking who was watching. Whatever came next, the funeral, the family, the fallout, I couldn't yet see coming. I knew one thing for certain. The one person who had never made me feel like an outsider was gone. And nothing about this family was going to make that easier. The funeral was small the way Margaret would have wanted it. No long speeches, no elaborate flowers, just a handful of people who actually knew her, standing under a gray October sky. While the pastor said words that didn't come close to capturing who she'd been, I stood between my parents and Daniel, feeling strangely outside my own body, the way you do when grief hasn't fully landed yet, and you're just going through the motions of standing, sitting, shaking hands. Daniel found me afterward near the cars, adjusting his tie like he had somewhere else to be. He didn't ask how I was holding up. He didn't ask about the flight, or whether I'd slept or anything at all about the 8 months since we'd last spoken. He just said, "Grandma left some paperwork. Mom's handling most of it." And then he was already looking past me toward his wife. I didn't think much of it at the time. I knew Margaret had some savings, maybe the house, though I'd genuinely never given it thought. I wasn't home for what I might get. I was home because the woman who taught me to believe in myself was gone, and some part of me still expected her to walk out of the kitchen with 2 cups of tea, like she used to telling me to sit down and rest my feet. Over the next few days, though, something started to needle at me. My family began talking in the careful coded way families do about next steps. A reading of the will was mentioned. Daniel talked about the house, Margaret's house, with a kind of easy ownership that struck me as strange. He mentioned repainting the porch. He mentioned whether the zoning would allow him to add a garage. "Did Grandma ever tell you that?" I asked. "That the house was yours?" He laughed, not unkindly, but with the confidence of someone who'd never once doubted his place in a room. "Come on, Catherine, you know how Grandma was. She always talked." I didn't argue. I told myself I was imagining tension where there wasn't any. That grief was making me suspicious of things that didn't deserve it. But 2 days later, my mother pulled me aside in the kitchen, drying a mug that didn't need drying, and told me the will was going to be read at the office of Margaret's lawyer, a man named Thomas Reed. "There really isn't any reason for you to sit through all of this," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Why not?" "Because it's family business." I looked at her for a long moment, waiting for her to hear what she just said. I was her daughter. I was Margaret's granddaughter, her actual blood, the person who had sat at that woman's table more Sundays than anyone else in this family combined, and somehow I was still the one being asked to step outside the room. I didn't fight her on it. I'd spent years choosing not to fight. Mostly because fighting never changed anything. It just gave her another story to tell about how difficult I was. So on the morning of the reading, I simply got dressed and drove myself to Thomas Reed's office, arriving exactly on time without asking anyone's permission. My parents and Daniel were already there. When I walked in, seated in a small waiting area, with the particular stillness of people who'd rehearsed how this was supposed to go, Thomas Reed stood to greet me himself. He was an older man, silver-haired, with the unhurried calm of someone who had spent 30 years telling people things they didn't want to hear. "Catherine," he said, extending his hand, "I'm glad you made it." My mother was on her feet before I'd even taken his hand. "She won't be staying." I turned to look at her. There was no hesitation in her voice at all, like this had already been decided somewhere I hadn't been invited. "Catherine, wait outside," she said. "This won't take long." I felt something tighten in my chest, but I didn't argue. I'd flown across the country to bury a woman who loved me, and I wasn't going to turn her lawyer's office into a battleground. I stood, gathered my jacket off the back of the chair, and started toward the door, telling myself this was just one more thing to let go of, one more door, closing quietly, the way they always did in this family. I had my hand on the handle when Thomas Reed's voice stopped me cold. "No," he said, "she stays." The room went silent in a way I can still feel in my chest when I think back on it. I turned around slowly. My mother's expression had shifted from irritation to something closer to alarm. Daniel was staring at Thomas, like the man had spoken out of turn, and I stood there in the doorway, one hand still on the handle, with the strange dawning sense that everything I thought I understood about my place in this family was about to be rewritten in that room. I let go of the door handle and walked back to the chair I just left. My mother didn't sit right away. She stood by the window with her arms crossed the way she used to when I was a teenager, and had done something she considered an embarrassment. "Thomas," she said, her voice tight and controlled. I already explained the situation. He didn't look up from the folder in front of him. "You explained your situation," he said. "I'm telling you the legal one." Daniel shifted in his seat beside me, and for the first time since I'd walked in, he looked less certain of himself. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and waited, my heart beating harder than I wanted to admit. Thomas opened the folder slowly, the way a man does when he's done this 100 times, and still respects the weight of it. He explained that Margaret had established her estate plan years earlier, and that it had been updated more recently than any of us realized. He said my name was listed directly in the documents, not as an afterthought, not as a courtesy, but as someone Margaret had specifically and repeatedly named. He didn't tell me what that meant yet. He simply began to read. Daniel was to receive several personal items: Margaret's watch collection, a set of tools that had belonged to our grandfather, some savings bonds she'd purchased for him years ago. My parents were named for a modest sum enough to cover final expenses, and then some. I listened without reaction, still bracing for whatever came next, still assuming I was somewhere near the bottom of a list that had never had my name near the top. Then Thomas turned a page and said, "The house?" I looked up. "The house," he explained. "The one with the yellow siding and the wraparound porch, the one where I'd spent every summer of my childhood shelling peas, and listening to Margaret's stories about her own mother. That house did not go to Daniel. It did not go to my parents. It had been left in full to me." Daniel was on his feet almost before Thomas finished the sentence. "That can't be right." Thomas didn't flinch. He simply turned the folder toward Daniel and slid it across the desk, the deed and the notarized amendment sitting plainly in black and white. Daniel stared at it, like the words might rearrange themselves if he looked hard enough. I sat very still, feeling something crack open in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. I hadn't known. I want to be clear about that. I hadn't asked, hadn't hoped, hadn't even let myself imagine that Margaret had thought of me this way. And yet here it was in ink undeniable, but Thomas wasn't finished. "Your grandmother also left instructions regarding a trust," he said, and something in his tone made the room go still again. Daniel's eyes cut toward our mother. My mother's composure, which had been holding by a thread since I walked back into that room, finally slipped. "Thomas, that's enough for today." "No," he said, calm as ever, "we're not finished." He reached into the folder and withdrew a sealed envelope, slightly yellowed at the edges, the kind of paper that had clearly sat untouched in a drawer for longer than a few weeks. He set it on the desk and turned it so I could read the front. "For Catherine Morgan to be opened only after my death." I stared at my own name in Margaret's handwriting, the same careful cursive she'd used to write birthday cards and grocery lists, and the note she'd tucked into my duffel bag the day I left for basic training. My hands were trembling slightly, and I pressed them flat against my knees to study them. "Your grandmother specifically instructed me to read this letter aloud," Thomas said, looking at me directly now, "in front of the family. Do you consent to that?" I nodded because I couldn't quite make my voice work. Thomas broke the seal, carefully unfolding the pages inside, but before he began to read, he looked up, not at me, but at my mother. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, his voice even and unhurried, "your mother anticipated that you might object to this." I watched my mother's face change. It wasn't anger exactly, and it wasn't grief. It was something closer to fear. The look of someone who suddenly understood that a door she'd spent years keeping shut was about to be opened whether she liked it or not. Thomas began to read, and the room seemed to hold its breath around him. "My dearest Catherine," the letter started, and just hearing her voice in those words, even secondhand, even filtered through a stranger's careful reading, undid something in me I'd been holding together since the funeral. I pressed my knuckles against my mouth and let the tears come without trying to stop them. Margaret didn't begin with money or property or anything practical at all. She began with a memory. She wrote about a little girl who used to stand on a kitchen chair beside her flower, on her hands asking questions no one else in the family wanted to answer. She remembered me asking her once, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Why Mom loved Daniel more. She said she never gave me a real answer back then, because I was too young to carry the truth. But she wasn't going to let that silence be the last thing between us. She wrote that my mother had always been afraid, not of me exactly, but of what I represented. A daughter who didn't need rescuing. A daughter who could build a life without anyone's help or permission. When I enlisted at 18, my mother didn't see courage. She saw abandonment, proof that I was choosing to need this family less, and that frightened her more than she ever let herself admit. Margaret saw it differently. She wrote that watching me walk into that recruiter's office was the proudest she had ever been of anyone in our family, because I was doing the one thing she'd never had the courage to do herself, building a life on my own terms. I sat with that for a moment, feeling my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with finally being seen. Then the letter shifted, and Thomas's voice took on a more careful, deliberate rhythm, the way a man reads when he already knows what's coming and wants to give the room time to absorb it. Margaret wrote that years earlier, Daniel had come to her in financial trouble, a business loan gone bad, more debt than his contracting company could carry. He hadn't gone to a bank. He'd gone to her, and she'd lent him a significant sum with the expectation that he would pay it back over time the way any responsible adult would. He never did. And when the time came to address it, my mother had intervened not to make Daniel pay what he owed, but to convince Margaret to simply write it off as a gift instead, so no one would have to have an uncomfortable conversation about it. Margaret agreed. But she set one condition. Daniel was to tell me the truth about it himself, so that I would never be operating with understanding of this family finances than everyone else. He never did that either. I glanced at Daniel. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the floor, jaw working, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he had nothing to say. I finally understood, sitting in that office, why my mother had spent years steering me away from any real conversation about money in this family. It wasn't caution, it was concealment. But the letter wasn't finished, and neither was Margaret. Catherine, there is something your mother never told you. Thomas read, and the words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. My mother rose out of her chair so fast it scraped against the floor. That's enough. Thomas didn't lower the page. Your mother asked me to read the entire letter, he said, and I understood with a small ache that he meant Margaret, not the woman standing across from him now shaking. He continued reading. I sat perfectly still, my hands pressed flat against my thighs. My whole body braced for whatever came next. Whatever it was, Margaret had wanted me to hear it exactly like this in this room in front of all of them, with no one able to soften it or explain it away before I had the chance to understand it for myself. 20 years of quiet family loyalty had led to this moment, and some part of me already sensed that nothing about the family I thought I knew was going to look the same. Once Thomas finished reading, I looked at my mother's face, pale and rigid by the window, and for the first time in my life, I saw something there I had never expected to see directed at me. Fear. Thomas kept reading, and Margaret's words carried us back further than I expected, back to a winter, 3 years earlier, when I was stationed overseas, and barely able to get a reliable phone signal, let alone keep close tabs on what was happening at home. That was the winter my father had a health scare. A cardiac event serious enough to require a procedure the insurance didn't fully cover, serious enough that my mother called me in a panic I'd never heard from her before. I remember standing outside a supply tent in the cold, listening to her cry on the phone, and I remember not hesitating for even a second. I sent money, a significant amount more than I could really spare, pulled from savings I'd been building for years. I told myself it didn't matter. He was my father. That was what you did. What I didn't know, what Margaret had written down in careful, deliberate detail, was that Daniel was going through his own financial collapse at almost exactly the same time. His business was weeks from folding, and a portion of the money I'd sent home, money I believed was going toward my father's medical bills, had quietly been redirected to keep Daniel's company afloat instead. I read the words on the page. After Thomas set the letter down for a moment, needing to see them myself, needing to be sure I hadn't misheard. Margaret had known. She'd confronted my mother about it directly according to the letter. My mother's response, word for word, preserved in Margaret's own hand. Daniel needs it more. Catherine has her career. I felt something in my chest go very cold and very quiet. Margaret hadn't let it go. From that point forward, she began keeping records, not out of spite, she wrote, but because she'd realized no one else in this family was going to protect me from being quietly taken advantage of, and she refused to let it continue without at least a witness. She kept copies of wire transfers, loan documents, bank statements, emails between my mother and Daniel discussing the arrangement, as they'd called it, like it was a business transaction instead of a betrayal. Thomas reached into the folder and set a thin stack of papers in front of me. I didn't touch them right away. I sat there aware of my own pulse in my ears, aware of Daniel's refusal to look at me, aware of my mother standing rigid by the window, with her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold. Then Thomas returned to the letter, and Margaret's voice, steady, unflinching, even from beyond the grave, explained why she'd left me the house. She wrote that it was never about loving me more than Daniel. It was about giving me something no one could quietly take away or redirect without my knowledge. A place that was fully, legally, undeniably mine. Somewhere no one could ever again stand in a doorway and tell me I didn't belong. I felt the tears come again. But this time they weren't only grief. They were something closer to relief. The strange, disorienting relief of finally having proof that what I'd felt for years wasn't imagined. Daniel finally spoke, his voice sharp and defensive. This is insane. She was 89. You don't know what kind of state she was in when she wrote this. Catherine, probably she's manipulating an old woman, is the accusation I expected. And it hung in the air even though he didn't finish the sentence. Thomas cut in before I had to respond. Your grandmother updated this estate plan 4 months before her death, he said, sliding another document across the desk. She was evaluated by her physician at the time, specifically for capacity at my request. There were 2 independent witnesses present for the signing, neither of whom are family. Her signature was notarized. I'd advise against pursuing a challenge, Mr. Morgan. It won't hold. Daniel sat back and, for the first time, I watched the certainty drain out of him completely. I looked down at the documents in front of me. Proof in black and white of a debt I never knew I was owed. A truth I never knew I'd been denied. Whatever came next, I understood one thing clearly. This family had spent years telling me I was the one who didn't belong, the one who'd chosen to walk away. But sit there with Margaret's careful records in my hands, I finally understood who had really been protecting whom. We didn't stay in that office much longer. Thomas gave us copies of everything, told me quietly on my way out that I could call him with any questions. Once the shock had settled, and reminded my mother that the house transfer would proceed regardless of how the family chose to handle things privately. I think he'd seen enough families come apart in that room to know there was nothing left for him to manage once the papers were signed. The unraveling happened over the following week, slow at first, and then all at once. Daniel called me 2 days later, his voice tight with the particular kind of anger that comes from someone who's used to getting what he wants. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't acknowledge the letter or the records or any of it. He went straight to the house. You're my sister, he said. You don't need it. I have a family. I have kids who will want that place someday. Did you ever ask Grandma if she wanted you to have it? I asked. Silence stretched out on the line long enough that I had my answer before he gave it. My mother called the next day, and her approach was different, softer, wounded, dressed up as concern. She talked about everything they'd sacrificed for us, the years of raising 2 children, the sleepless nights, the effort. After everything we've done for you, she said, her voice cracking in a way I might have believed a year ago. I stood in my grandmother's kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear, looking at the chair Margaret used to sit in every morning with her coffee, and I finally said the thing I'd been swallowing for 20 years. That's exactly the problem, Mom. You always made me feel like I owed you for being your daughter. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call her cruel or unfair, or any of the words that had been building in me since that dining room table months earlier. I just said it plainly, the way you'd state a fact you'd finally stopped being afraid of. There was a long pause on the other end, and then she hung up. Over the following weeks, I went through the file Thomas had given me. It was more thorough than I expected. Bank records going back nearly a decade. A paper trail Margaret had clearly built with care, as though she'd known someday I would need it, laid out in a way I couldn't dismiss or doubt. I found out that the successful business Daniel had built with his own hands was propped up more than once by money that had come from both our parents and from the funds I'd sent home, believing they were going somewhere else entirely. The hardest part wasn't the money. It was recognizing the pattern underneath it. For years, this family had painted me as the selfish one, the daughter who left, who chose a uniform over holidays, who couldn't be counted on because her schedule belonged to the army instead of them. Meanwhile, quietly, without credit or even acknowledgement, I had been sending money home every chance I got, doing exactly what a devoted daughter was supposed to do, and that devotion had been redirected without my consent to cover for the son, who never had to prove anything to anyone. I thought about confronting Daniel with all of it, laying every transfer and every email on the table, and making him answer for each one. Some nights I wanted to, but when it came down to it, I realized that wasn't the kind of person Margaret had raised me to be, or the kind of person the army had trained me to become. Vindication didn't require destruction. So when Daniel called one final time demanding again that I sign the house over, I gave him my answer clearly and without anger. I'm not going to destroy my family over money, I told him. And then, because it needed to be said, I added, but I'm done protecting people who never protected me. I kept the house, not to punish him, not even really to punish my mother, though I won't pretend there wasn't some quiet justice in it. I kept it because it was the last thing Margaret had given me, the clearest proof I would ever have that someone in this family had truly seen me. Not the version of me they'd found convenient, but the actual person I'd worked so hard to become. Spring came slowly that year, the way it always does in Ohio. Mud and bare branches, giving way to something green, almost against your will. I spent most of my leave that season at the house, sleeves rolled up, learning how to fix a leaking faucet and patch a section of porch railing that had been rotting quietly for years. I didn't hire anyone to do it for me. I wanted my hands on every part of that place before I let myself call it mine. I kept the kitchen almost exactly as it had been. The same chipped yellow tile, the same curtains a Margaret had sewn herself sometime in the 80s, faded now, but still hanging straight. I kept her chair by the window, the one with the worn armrests, where she used to sit with her coffee and watch the birds at the feeder. Some mornings I sit in it myself, and for just a moment, the house feels less empty than it should. Daniel's business didn't survive the year without the quiet cushion of family money he'd relied on for so long. The cracks that had always been there finally gave way. I heard about it secondhand through an aunt who still speaks to both of us, and I felt something more complicated than satisfaction. Not joy, exactly, but not grief either. Mostly, I felt tired, the particular exhaustion that comes from watching a pattern finally run its course. My mother called more often after that. The first few calls were still edged with blame, subtle reminders of everything she believed she was owed. But over time, something in her tone began to shift. The blame turned into something quieter, something that sounded on its best days almost like an apology, though she never quite said the word outright. I let her talk, I answered honestly. But I didn't rush back into the version of closeness she seemed to want. The kind where the last 2 years could simply be folded up and put away. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending it never happened. I told her once, standing on Margaret's porch with the phone against my ear, watching the sun drop behind the tree. I meant it as gently as I could, but I meant it fully. Forgiveness, I'd come to understand, wasn't a door you threw wide open. It was something you built slowly, brick by brick, only as far as trust could actually go. On a quiet Sunday in early June, I drove out to the cemetery alone. The grass had grown in fully around Margaret's headstone, soft and green, and I knelt to clear away a few stray leaves before setting down a small bundle of wild flowers I'd cut from her own garden that morning. You were the only person who never made me question whether I belonged. I said out loud, feeling a little foolish, and not caring at all. The wind moved through the trees behind me, and for a moment it felt like she might actually be listening. I took her letter out of my jacket pocket, worn soft now from months of folding and unfolding, and read the last lines again, the ones I'd nearly memorized by heart. She'd written that I never needed to become the child my family chose. I only needed to become someone I could be proud of on my own terms, in my own time, without anyone's permission. I folded the letter carefully and looked back toward the house, its yellow siding catching the late afternoon light. The porch swings, swaying slightly in the breeze, like someone had just gotten up from it. And, for the first time, in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel like the daughter standing outside a door that wouldn't open for her. I felt like a woman standing in front of a home that was entirely unquestionably her own. If this story moved you even a little, I'd love to know where it found you. Drop a comment below and tell me what part stayed with you the longest. I read every single one. We've got so many more stories like Catherine's waiting to be told, so if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. Let's keep going together. I was about to sit at the dinner table. My stepmother pushed my chair away. A military woman doesn't belong in this family. The room went silent. My stepbrother started recording his phone, raised like a weapon he'd been waiting years to use. My father stared at his plate. I stood there in my travel clothes, still smelling like airport coffee and 11 months of someone else's war. And I felt something inside me go very still, very cold, very calm. I stood up straight. I smiled. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. 3 days earlier, I'd been standing on a tarmac in Germany, watching a transport plane fold up the last 11 months of my life into a duffel bag. I was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, and I had spent nearly a year running logistics for a battalion that never stopped moving, never stopped needing, never stopped testing what I was made of. I had learned to sleep in 4-hour intervals. I had learned to make decisions that mattered inside 60 seconds. What I had not learned, apparently, was how to walk into my father's dining room and be welcomed. My father called me the week before I came home. His voice had that particular warmth he saved for occasions, the same warmth he'd used at my college graduation and my commissioning ceremony. Moments where love was easy because it came with an audience. "We're doing a family dinner, Leah," he said. "Everyone wants to see you." I should have heard the word everyone for what it was, not just him, not just us. Everyone now included Linda, his wife of 6 years, and Brian, her son from a previous marriage, a 26-year-old who had never held a job longer than 8 months, and who called himself an entrepreneur, the way some men call themselves poets, as a way of avoiding the word unemployed. I bought gifts anyway, a leather wallet for my father, the kind he'd had in a catalog once years ago that I'd never forgotten. A bottle of bourbon for Brian because I still believed foolishly that decency could be modeled rather than demanded. And for Linda, a scarf, soft gray cashmere, chosen with more care than she probably imagined I was capable of. I have always believed that showing up with open hands says something a person can't argue with. I was wrong about that too, as it turned out. Some people don't want your open hands, they want your empty chair. The house looked the same as it always did, pale, yellow siding. The porch light my mother had picked out before she died. The maple tree I used to climb until my father told me, "Girls shouldn't be up in trees." My mother has been gone 11 years now, and the ache of that has softened into something more like weather than wound. A low-pressure system that moves through on certain days, and then moves on. I walked up that porch with a box of gifts, and a duffel bag still smelling of jet fuel. And I told myself this would be fine. Family is family, I told myself. That sentence has never once been simple, and it wasn't tonight, either. Linda opened the door with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. "Leah," she said like my name was something she'd had to practice. Brian was in the living room, feet on the coffee table, phone already in his hand, though nothing had happened yet, a detail I would only understand the weight of later. My father hugged me the way he always did, quick, a little stiff, a man who loved his daughter, and had never quite learned how to show it without an apology built into the gesture. "You look good," he said, tired but good. Dinner smelled like it always had in that house on special occasions. Roast chicken, rosemary, the yeasty warmth of Linda's dinner rolls, which I'll admit were genuinely good. A small, strange betrayal of my own resentment. The table was set with the my mother used to use only at Christmas. Nobody mentioned that. I noticed it the way I notice everything now. A habit the army gave me that civilian life has never managed to take back. Scan the room, catalog the details, know where the exits are. Linda talked through most of dinner prep about a reasonable, grounded life, about people who build things with their hands and their minds, rather than playing soldier for a paycheck and a pension. She said this while looking at a spot just past my shoulder, never quite at me, the coward's way of throwing a punch. My father said nothing. Brian smirked into his water glass. I told myself I would let it go. I had faced worse than a woman who resented a stepdaughter she never asked for. Then it was time to sit. I pulled out my chair. The one that had always been mine, the one on my mother's china side of the table. And Linda's hand shot out and pushed it 2 feet to the left hard enough that it scraped against the hardwood floor like a small scream. "A military woman doesn't belong in this family," she said loud enough for the whole table. Loud enough for God. Loud enough that there was no pretending afterward that it had been a joke or a slip. The room went dead silent. My father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. And Brian lifted his phone and started recording, grinning like a boy who had just been handed the best birthday present of his life. I looked at my father, he looked at his plate. I picked up my gifts, set them gently on the sideboard, so as not to give Brian the satisfaction of a dramatic exit, and I stood there for one long moment, feeling 11 months of discipline settle into my spine like armor. I smiled, not the tight, polite smile people expect from a woman who's just been humiliated, but something calmer, something that unsettled Linda far more than tears would have. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," I said, and I walked out into the cold October evening without raising my voice once. Behind me, I heard Brian laughing already, imagining how many views his video would get, already believing he'd just captured the moment his uptight, humorless sister finally got what was coming to her. He had no idea what he had actually just done. None of them did. The hotel room was quiet in a way my father's house never had been, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before I did anything at all. I didn't cry. I want to say that plainly, because I think people expect a woman who's just been humiliated at her own family's dinner table to fall apart, to call a friend and sob into the phone, to drink too much wine and stare at the ceiling. Norts, I didn't do any of that. I sat very still, the way I'd learned to sit still during long convoys and longer briefings, and I let the anger settle into something usable, instead of something that would burn me from the inside. What Linda didn't know, what almost none of them knew, was that I wasn't just a soldier who'd wandered off to play at a career my father's wife found embarrassing. My mother, before she died, had built something. She'd been sharp about money in a way people underestimated, because she wore cardigans and baked bread and never once raised her voice in an argument. She'd set aside investments over the years, quiet, patient, unglamorous. And when she passed, control of a good portion of that came to me, not in a lump sum I could spend on something foolish, but structured, protected, tied up in a trust with conditions she'd written herself. Conditions I hadn't thought much about in years, because I'd never had reason to. I never told my father the details, partly because grief made money feel obscene to talk about in the months after she died, and partly because I watched him remarry within 2 years, and understood in the private way children understand their parents, without being told that he needed a version of the story where he'd moved on cleanly, where nothing from his first marriage still had a hand on his life. I let him have that story. I stepped back. I visited on holidays, sent cards, kept my distance the way you keep distance from a stove you already know is hot, and I told myself that was maturity rather than avoidance. Around midnight, my phone started buzzing. A friend from high school, someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year, sent me a link with 3 exclamation points and no other words. Brian had posted the video. He'd captioned it something like, "When your sister thinks the army makes her better than everyone else." Misspelled, predictably, The word everyone rendered as everyone, which under different circumstances I might have found almost funny. The video had already picked up a few thousand views by the time I watched it. My own face calm and unreadable in the dim light of my father's dining room, Linda's voice sharp and satisfied beside me. The comments split the way comments always do. Some people defended me, called Linda cruel, called Brian pathetic for filming his own sister's humiliation instead of standing up. Others took Linda's side, said something about entitled veterans, said the military wasn't a personality, said a dozen small ugly things that would have stung more if I hadn't spent a career being underestimated by people who had never once had to make a decision that mattered. I didn't respond to any of it. I didn't share it, didn't defend myself, didn't post some tearful video of my own explaining my side. I turned my phone face down on the nightstand and let it happen without me. That restraint wasn't performance. It was strategy, though I didn't fully understand my own strategy yet. I only knew with the certainty of someone who has learned not to move until she understands the terrain that reacting now would cost me more than waiting would. The call from my lawyer came the next morning earlier than seeing his voice careful in the way lawyers get when they're about to hand you something heavier than small talk. His name was Walter Greaves, a quiet, precise man who had managed my mother's estate since before I'd finished my first deployment. And in 6 years he had never once called me without warning. "Lee," he said, "we need to talk about the house." I sat up straighter, coffee forgotten. He explained it slowly. The way you explain something to a person you suspect is about to be blindsided. The house my father lived in, the house I'd grown up in, the house with the maple tree and the porch light my mother chose, sat on land that had never actually belonged to my father outright. My mother had placed it along with several other assets into a trust years before she died. A trust designed to protect the property for the family long term, rather than leave it vulnerable to remarriage, debt, or bad decisions made in grief. My father had a life estate, the right to live there for as long as he wanted undisturbed, but he did not have the right to sell it. Any sale required the signature of the trust's co-trustee, me. I hadn't thought about that clause in years. I'd signed the original paperwork numbly, 24 years old and freshly grieving, barely reading the language my mother's lawyer had explained to me in careful, gentle sentences. I understood, sitting in that hotel room, with the morning light coming in flat and gray through the curtains, exactly why Linda had spent 6 years chipping away at my place in that family, why every holiday had felt like an audition I kept failing. Why she'd wanted me gone from that dinner table so badly she'd been willing to humiliate me in front of my own father to make it happen. It had never really been about the army at all. "Leah," Walter said, and I could hear him choosing his next words with unusual care. "Someone has already filed paperwork to begin the sale." I met Walter in person, 2 days later in his office downtown. The kind of office that hadn't changed its furniture since my mother first sat across that same desk 20 years earlier. He had the file open before I even sat down, a manila folder thick with documents I hadn't looked at since I was a grieving 24-year-old signing whatever was placed in front of me. "I want to walk you through exactly what's happening," he said, "before you decide anything." I appreciated that about Walter. He had never once tried to tell me how to feel about my own family. He only ever told me the truth and let me arrive at my own conclusions. The picture he laid out was uglier than I expected, though. By then, I don't know why I expected anything else. Linda had been quietly pushing my father towards selling the house for the better part of a year, framing it always as practicality. The place was too big for 2 people, the taxes kept climbing. Wouldn't it be nice to downsize somewhere warmer, somewhere easier? What she never mentioned to him, what she'd apparently gone to some trouble to keep buried, was where the proceeds were actually meant to go. Brian had been developing what he called a business, some vague venture involving imported furniture, and an online store that, as far as Walter's preliminary digging could tell, existed mostly as a website and a dream. He needed capital. His mother intended to hand him a piece of my father's house to get it. The trust documents were specific in ways Linda clearly hadn't anticipated, or had hoped my father would never actually read closely. My mother, methodical even in her dying, had built-in language requiring co-trustee approval for any sale, transfer, or major encumbrance of the property with my signature, as the second trustee explicitly required. Somewhere along the way, Linda had either misunderstood this or, and this felt more likely given the pattern Walter was uncovering, chosen to believe she could get the paperwork through before anyone thought to check. She'd found a buyer fast, a young couple relocating for a new job, eager and a little naive. Exactly snorts the kind of buyers who wouldn't ask too many questions about trustee structures if the price was right and the timeline was tight. Brian, for his part, seemed to have no idea any of this was remotely complicated. He posted about it the way he posted about everything, with more confidence than information. A photo of a gated community, 2 towns over captioned something about new beginnings and finally getting what we deserve. A story about test driving a car he clearly couldn't afford yet, tagged with a location at a dealership showroom. He believed, with the total certainty of a man who had never once had to earn anything, the slow way that he was about to be handed enough money to finally become the person he'd always told people he already was. I sat with all of this for a long moment, watching dust drift through the light from Walter's window, and I felt the old army instinct take over the part of me that had learned in convoys and command posts that the worst thing you can do with incomplete intelligence is act on it too early. The sale is void without my signature, I said. It wasn't a question. Walter nodded. Completely void. No court in the state would uphold a transfer that bypasses a named co-trustee, especially not one this clearly documented. Then I'm not going to stop it, I said. Walter looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look a careful man gives you when he suspects you're about to do something either very smart or very reckless, and hasn't yet decided which. You want to let it proceed? I want to let it get as far as the closing table, I said. I want them standing there, believing it's done before anyone tells them otherwise. I won't pretend that decision came from a place of pure discipline. Some part of it was anger, an old cold anger that had been sitting in me since a chair scraped against hardwood in front of my own father's silence. But most of it, if I'm honest, was something closer to justice than revenge. A need for the truth to arrive in a room where everyone could see it plainly, rather than in a private phone call. Linda could spin, minimize, or twist into another story about how unreasonable I was being. I had spent 6 years watching her control every narrative in that family, with quiet, patient persistence. I wasn't interested in fire and whispers. I wanted daylight. I didn't warn my father. That was the hardest part, harder than staying silent through dinner. Harder than watching Brian's video rack up comments I refused to read past the first few lines. My father was still in his heart a decent man who had simply never learned how to stand up to the people closest to him. Not to my mother when she was alive, and pushing him toward better choices, and not to Linda now. Warning him meant trusting. He could hold the secret, and some instinct, some old wound told me he couldn't. So I did the only thing that felt honest under the circumstances. I waited. 3 weeks passed in a strange, watchful quiet. I went back to work. Caught up on medical appointments the Army required, saw a few old friends who asked careful questions about the video, and accepted my vague answers without pushing. Meanwhile, Walter kept me updated in short, precise phone calls. The buyers had made an offer. The offer had been accepted. Inspections were scheduled, then completed. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, Walter called with the detail that told me the end was closer than I'd thought. They've got us a purchase agreement, he said. The just put down a deposit, $320,000 held in escrow. He paused. Closing is set for 2 weeks from Friday. The law office, where the closing was scheduled, sat on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown. The kind of place with a view meant to make people feel like they were making an important decision. Which in this case, they very much were, whether they understood that yet or not. I arrived 20 minutes early, dressed not in uniform but in a simple charcoal suit, my hair pulled back the way I wore it for formal briefings. My expression I hoped unreadable. Walter met me in the hallway outside his face, composed, but his eyes carrying the particular energy of a man who has spent 3 weeks quietly building toward a moment he believes in. "You don't have to do this the dramatic way," he said, not for the first time. "I can simply block the filing before anyone gets in the room." "I know," I said, "but they need to see it happen, all of them." He didn't argue further. I think by then he understood something about me that even I hadn't fully articulated yet, that this was never only about stopping a fraudulent sale. It was about a family that had spent years underestimating me, dismissing 11 months of my life, spent commanding logistics for hundreds of soldiers as playing at a career, and I needed them to understand in a room with witnesses exactly how much they had misjudged. I waited in a small side office while the closing began, watching through a gap in the door. Linda arrived first, dressed the way she dressed for church or funerals. Something structured and expensive. Her chin lifted with the particular confidence of a woman who believes she has already won. Brian trailed behind her, phone raised, narrating for an audience that had grown considerably since his last video went semi-viral. "We're here," he said into the camera, grinning. "Closing on the house today, guys. Big day for the family." He had no idea how correct that sentence was about to become. My father arrived last, quieter than the other two, dressed in the same tan jacket he'd worn to my commissioning ceremony years earlier, a detail that struck me harder than I expected it to. He still believed, as far as I could tell, that this was simply a practical transition. An aging man downsizing with his wife's help. Nothing more sinister than that. He had no idea his late wife's trust was about to walk through that door in the form of his daughter. The buyers, a young couple named the Ortegas, sat across the table, looking cautiously hopeful, the way people look when they're about to make the biggest purchase of their lives, and are trying not to let their excitement show too plainly. The closing attorney, a calm older man named Mr. Pham, began working through the paperwork with practiced efficiency, sliding documents across the table for signatures, murmuring the small procedural phrases that fill these rooms: initial here, sign here, and here. Linda signed with a flourish. Brian kept filming, occasionally panning the camera toward his mother, with a proud, encouraging grin, as if she were closing a business deal on television. My father signed more slowly, the pen hovering a moment too long over the paper, the only visible sign that some part of him understood this moment carried more weight than he was letting himself feel. Then Mr. Pham paused, flipping back through the stack in front of him, his brow tightening slightly, in the particular way of a man who has just noticed something his checklist won't let him ignore. "We are missing one required trustee," he said, more to himself than to the room, scanning the trust documentation a second time. "The property is held under a trust with co-trustee signature requirements. I only have Mr. Thompson's signature here." Linda's smile flickered just barely. "That shouldn't be necessary," she said quickly. "My husband owns the property outright. According to this document," Mr. Pham said, tapping the page, "he holds a life estate. The trust itself requires the signature of a second trustee for any transfer or sale." He looked up. "Is there someone else who needs to be present?" That was my moment, and I took it without hurrying, walking through the door the way I'd walked into command briefings 100 times before, calm, deliberate, but betraying nothing. "That would be me," I said. The room went silent in a way I will remember for the rest of my life. Brian's phone lowered, and the live stream still running, still capturing every second of what was about to unfold, a fact he would come to regret bitterly in the weeks ahead. Linda's face drained of color so fast it was almost clinical, her mouth opening slightly before closing again with nothing to say. My father turned toward me, with an expression I couldn't fully read, shock certainly, but underneath it, something that looked almost like relief, as if some part of him had been waiting for someone to finally stop this train before it reached the end of the tracks. I set a folder on the table. The documents Walter had prepared weeks earlier, the original trust, my mother's signature at the bottom, in the careful looping handwriting I would recognize anywhere. The clause naming me co-trustee with equal authority over any transfer of the property. Mr. Pham reviewed it methodically, and within minutes confirmed what I already knew. The sale as structured could not proceed. Not that day, not without my consent, which I made clear calmly, and without raising my voice. I had no intention of giving. The Ortegas, to their credit, handled the news with more grace than anyone else in the room. But their agent, watching a $300,000 deposit suddenly hang in legal limbo, was considerably less gracious. And by the time everyone filed out of that office, I heard him on the phone in the hallway, voice tight with fury, already using words like misrepresentation and legal action in the same sentence as Linda's name. My father didn't speak on the drive back to the house. I rode with him, Linda and Brian having left separately, in a silence so heavy even Brian had stopped filming, some instinct finally catching up to him, that this was no longer content, that this was his family actually falling apart in real time. My father gripped the steering wheel with both hands, knuckles pale, his eyes fixed straight ahead in the particular way of a man, trying very hard not to let his face show what he was feeling. When we finally pulled into the driveway, he sat there a long moment before turning off the engine. "I didn't know," he said quietly, "about the trust, about any of it." "I know," I said. "Your mother never told me." "She told me the week before she died," I said. "I think she knew even then that things might change after she was gone, that people might not stay who they seemed to be." I hadn't meant it as an accusation, but I watched it land on him like one anyway, and I let the silence sit, rather than soften it. Some truths don't need softening. They need room to be understood. Walter arrived an hour later with the full file, the same one he'd shown me weeks before. Except now he laid it out across my father's kitchen table, piece by piece, patiently, the way you'd walk someone through a diagnosis they weren't prepared for. My father read through it in near silence, occasionally removing his glasses to press his fingers against his eyes, and I watched 11 years of a marriage he'd trusted completely reveal itself as something considerably more complicated than he'd allowed himself to see. There were emails Linda had exchanged with a real estate agent nearly a year earlier, long before she'd ever mentioned downsizing to my father, discussing the property's value and potential buyers, with a specificity that made clear this had never been a spontaneous idea born of practical concerns. There were text messages between Linda and Brian, screenshots the young couple's own agent had actually forwarded to Walter once the deal collapsed and questions started flying about. Who had known what messages in which Linda assured her son the sale was basically done and told him not to worry about the details, that she'd handle Leah's part when the time came. Whatever handling me had meant, it apparently hadn't included telling me anything at all. Worse, buried near the bottom of the file, was something Walter had only uncovered in the final days before closing a document, purporting to be an old amendment to the trust, supposedly signed by my mother years before her death, granting my father expanded authority to sell the property without co-trustee approval under certain conditions. The signature on it was close enough that a distracted eye might not question it, but Walter, who had spent decades staring at my mother's actual signature on dozens of documents, had flagged it immediately as inconsistent. The pressure wrong, the loop of the L, slightly too controlled, too deliberate, the kind of forgery that comes from someone practicing in private, rather than signing in the natural rush of a real life. He'd sent it quietly to a document examiner, the week before, closing less as an accusation and more as due diligence, and the results had come back only that morning before we'd even walked into the closing room. Forged. Not with total certainty in every technical sense, the examiner had noted, but with enough confidence that no attorney or court would treat it as authentic. My father set the papers down and looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at me. "Did you know about this one before today?" "Walter told me an hour before we walked in," I said. I didn't want to believe it either. Brian showed up at the house that evening uninvited, his face carrying an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not the smug confidence of the dinner table video, not the eager grin of his live streams, but something closer to fear. He'd apparently spent the afternoon on the phone with his mother, and whatever she'd told him hadn't matched what he was now hearing from my father in the kitchen. Mom said the trust thing was a formality. He said to no one in particular. She said it was basically already handled. It wasn't a formality, my father said, and his voice had a firmness in it I hadn't heard directed at Linda or Brian in years. It was fraud, Brian. Someone forged your grandmother's signature. I watched something shift in Brian's face, then watched 26 years of unquestioning loyalty to his mother crack under the specific, undeniable weight of a forged document sitting on a kitchen table. He didn't defend her. He didn't say another word, actually. Just sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs and stared at his hands, and for the first time since I'd known him, I felt something closer to pity than contempt. Linda arrived 20 minutes later, still in her closing day clothes, her composure noticeably thinner than it had been that morning. My father met her at the door before she could even step inside, and I heard his voice through the screen low and controlled in a way that told me exactly how much restraint it was costing him. "Pack a bag tonight," he said. "I want you out by morning. The internet has a long memory when it wants one." And within days of the closing collapsing, someone connected the dots between Brian's original dinner table video and the growing rumors about a forged trust document circulating in local real estate circles. Someone had recognized my father's street in the background of one of Brian's live streams. Someone else had put together a timeline. And before long, the old clip, the one where Linda shoved my chair aside and told me a military woman didn't belong in this family, was resurfacing with a very different caption attached to it. This time, people weren't just commenting on a stepmother's cruelty. They were connecting it to a woman who had apparently tried to defraud her own husband and stepdaughter out of a house that had never fully belonged to her. Brian bore the brunt of it first, and in some ways, I think that was fair, though I never took pleasure in watching it happen. The comments on his original video, the ones that had once been split fairly evenly between people defending him and people criticizing him, tilted hard and fast in one direction once the fuller story emerged. People pointed out correctly that he'd filmed his own sister's humiliation, not because he cared about justice or family loyalty, but because he'd believed it would make good content, would rack up views, would paint him as the clever son in on a joke at my expense. Now that same photo was being used as evidence of exactly the kind of person he was, someone who filmed cruelty instead of stopping it. The financial fallout hit him even harder than the public embarrassment. The Ortega's agent, furious at watching a $300,000 deposit tied up in legal limbo because of what he was now calling accurately a fraudulent transaction, filed a formal complaint against Linda with the State Real Estate Commission, and separately pursued a civil claim to recover damages and legal costs. Brian's furniture business, the one he'd been counting on funding through his mother's scheme, evaporated before it ever truly existed. No house sale meant no capital. No capital meant no inventory. No inventory meant the whole venture folded quietly, the website taken down within a week. The dream of a gated community 2 towns over reduced to a handful of screenshots. People online delighted in reposting with cruel new captions of their own. Linda hired a lawyer almost immediately, a sharp, expensive one from a firm 2 counties over, and I heard through Walter that her defense strategy leaned heavily on distancing herself from the forged document, insisting she'd had no direct knowledge it wasn't authentic, that she'd simply trusted an old family friend who'd helped locate the paperwork. Whether that was true or not, I honestly couldn't say with certainty, and some part of me suspected I never fully would. What I did know, from the document examiner's findings and the pattern of emails Walter had compiled, was that someone had gone to considerable trouble to make that signature convincing, and Linda had been the only person with a clear motive to want it to exist. My father called me 2 weeks after everything fell apart, his voice quieter than I'd heard it in years, and asked if I would come by the house. I drove over expecting another conversation about paperwork, about lawyers, about the mechanical business of untangling a marriage from a fraud investigation. Instead, I found him sitting alone at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd once eaten Sunday dinners as a family of 3 before Linda, before Brian, before any of it. He'd made coffee. He didn't drink his. "I keep thinking about that night," he said, not looking up. "The dinner." I didn't say anything. I'd learned over the years that silence was often the more honest response when someone was working their way toward something difficult. "I sat there," he said, "and I watched her push your chair. and I watched Brian film it, and I didn't say a single word. He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were wet in a way I hadn't seen since my funeral. I told myself I was keeping the peace. That's what I told myself, that I was just trying to keep things calm. But I wasn't keeping the peace, Leah. I was choosing her comfort over your dignity. And I've had 11 months to figure out how to say that to you. And I still don't know how. I sat down across from him, the coffee between us going cold, and I thought about 11 months in Germany, about all the versions of strength the army had taught me: how to hold a room, how to make a hard call, how to stand perfectly still while someone underestimated me, and let that underestimate become their mistake instead of mine. None of that training had prepared me for this particular moment. My father's voice cracking over a cold cup of coffee, finally saying the thing I'd needed to hear for 6 years. The thing that hurt the most wasn't what she said. I told him, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. It was your silence. I could have handled her. I've handled worse than Linda Thompson. What I couldn't handle was watching my own father look at his plate instead of looking at me. He didn't try to defend himself after that. He just put his face in his hands, and for the first time in my entire adult life, I watched my father cry. Not the careful, controlled tears of a funeral, but something raw, something that had clearly been sitting in him for a long time, waiting for someone to finally give him permission to let it out. I had every legal right to remove my father from that house. As co-trustee, once the fraud was fully documented, and Linda's claim to any interest in the property was dissolved, Walter told me plainly that I could restructure the trust however I saw fit, could sell the property immediately if I wanted, could even ask my father to find somewhere else to live. If some part of me had wanted to punish him further, for 11 months of silence, I'd carried like a stone in my chest. I sat with that option for exactly one evening alone in my apartment near base, staring at the ceiling the way I had the night of the dinner. And I understood by morning that I had no interest in becoming the kind of person who used power the way it had just been used against me. I called Walter the next day and asked him to draft an amendment instead. My father would retain his life estate undisturbed for as long as he wanted to live in that house. The porch light my mother had chosen still burning every evening, the maple tree still standing in the side yard, whatever piece remained for him still intact. But I added something new, something my mother, I think, would have approved of even more than the original trust. Upon my father's passing, the house would be sold, and the full proceeds would fund a scholarship for the children of service members killed in the line of duty. A small, permanent thing built out of a story that could have ended in nothing but bitterness. My father cried again when I told him, though more quietly this time, more like relief than grief. You didn't have to do that, he said, after everything. I know, I said. That's why I did it. Brian came to see me about a month later, driving out to the small town near my base in a car considerably less impressive than the one he'd been test driving in his old posts. He looked different, thinner, somehow quieter. A young man who had spent several weeks watching his mother's life come apart on a public stage he himself had helped build. He apologized, and I believed him mostly because the apology came without any request attached to it. No ask for money. No ask for a second chance at the business. Just a plain halting admission that he'd been cruel and careless, and that he understood now exactly what he'd cost people, including himself. I told him I forgave him, and I meant it. But I also told him gently that forgiveness and closeness were two different things, and that I didn't know if I'd ever fully trust him the way family is supposed to trust each other. He nodded like he'd expected that answer, like some part of him already knew he hadn't yet earned anything more. Linda's case moved through the system slower than any of us expected, the way these things often do. The real estate commission suspended proceedings pending the outcome of the forgery investigation, and the Ortega's civil suit against her dragged into the following spring, ending, eventually in a settlement that cost her far more than the profit she'd been chasing. I heard secondhand that she'd moved to a small apartment 2 towns over, that she and my father finalized their divorce quietly without the dramatics that had defined so much of their marriage's final year. I never spoke to her again after that night at the closing table, and I've made peace with the fact that I probably never will. I went back to my unit that spring, back to the particular rhythm of a life spent in service to something larger than my own family drama. And I found myself thinking more than once about the strange shape justice had taken in this story. I hadn't sued anyone out of spite. I hadn't posted my own video, hadn't fought Linda's cruelty with cruelty of my own, hadn't given Brian the satisfaction of watching me lash out the way his video had clearly hoped I would. I had simply waited quietly for the truth to walk into a room on its own and let it stand there in front of everyone until there was nothing left to argue about. The morning I drove back to base, my father walked me out to my car, the way he used to. When I first left for basic training all those years ago, standing in the driveway, with his hands in his pockets, watching me load the last of my things into the trunk. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said, and his voice didn't crack this time, steady in a way it hadn't been in months. I looked back at the house one last time. The yellow siding, the porch light, the maple tree with its branches bare and waiting for spring. And I felt something settle in me that I hadn't felt in a long time, something that wasn't quite peace and wasn't quite triumph, but sat somewhere honest between the two. I had lost a stepmother I never wanted, and a stepbrother I might never fully trust again. But I had gotten something back that mattered more. A father who finally understood what his silence had cost, and the quiet certainty that some inheritances aren't about money or houses at all. They're about who chooses in the end to stand up for you when it matters, and who simply looks down at their plate. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear where it landed with you. Have you ever had to wait quietly for the truth to speak for itself? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone, and I'm always amazed by how many of you carry stories just like this one. We share stories like Leah's every single day here. Real, raw, and full of the kind of justice that doesn't always come fast, but always comes fair. If you want to keep walking these journeys with me, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. I'll see you in the next story.